Minister K Shanmugam.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I would like to address some of the questions that have been raised in relation to enforcement against KTV outlets specifically. In this House and outside, there have been a number of questions related to KTVs. Why were KTVs and nightclubs allowed to operate as F&B outlets? The enforcement regime in respect of these outlets, why were hostesses allowed in those places, and the immigration status of those providing hostessing service at these places. For example, I can refer to a Facebook post by Mr. Alan John, former editor of Straits Times, raising some of these questions in a very succinct way and making a number of fair points based on his understanding of the facts. And I'll address these questions. First, why were KTVs allowed to change into F&B operations? During the circuit breaker last year, nightlife outlets were shut from 27th of March 2020, together with many other businesses. From phase 2, which June 2020, many businesses were allowed to reopen, including dine-in at F&B outlets. Massage establishments were also allowed to open with conditions, but KTVs were not allowed to reopen. We took a stricter approach with KTVs because singing was considered a high-risk activity in an indoor setting and a higher risk of transmission. In August of 2020, the Singapore Nightlife Business Association, called them SNBA, and the Singapore Entertainment Affiliation, SEA, other associations, as well as individual businesses, appealed for KTVs to reopen. They had been closed by then for several months. Jobs, livelihoods of those in the KTV industries, the workers, their jobs were at risk, badly affected, even with financial support from the government. Our assessment is that they probably employed about 10,000 local workers as of end 2019. Some of us met directly with the KTV businesses in August of 2020, listened to them. There were several town hall sessions. They asked to have singing, dancing to resume, and they proposed a pilot with a maximum of 5 persons in a room. Masks would be worn when not singing, and disposable microphone covers would be used. And they referred to other countries, including South Korea, where this had been allowed. Others proposed changing their business models to F&B outlets. They needed help to get new permits, change their use for F&B and so on. And for many, the situation was desperate. We considered their suggestions, weighed the risks. At one time, we considered possibly allowing a pilot project for KTVs with very strict conditions, but eventually we didn't proceed. So the first point to note is from March of 2020 until now, KTV operations remain forbidden. It's illegal to have any kind of KTV operations. Right? We didn't allow those. Then the group that had asked to move over to provide F&B on a temporary basis, we said okay to that, again with several conditions. Why? Because basically anyone can offer and open an F&B outlet. And the government can't specifically say no to KTV outlets which want to become F&B outlets, provided they have the space to be an F&B, premises allow F&B outlets, and can get approval from SFA, land use permissions, and so on. And conditions were imposed. The pivoted businesses would need a food preparation area to prepare and serve food, adequate indoor dining area for customers to be seated to have their meals, with safe distancing in place. And once converted to F&B, they were subject to the same safe management measures, SMMs, imposed on F&B outlets, meaning no intermingling amongst patrons and staff, no live music, no performances, various other conditions. So in summary, since from March 2020 until now, 1, KTVs were not allowed to operate, and 2, some KTVs were allowed to become F&B outlets, as well as some pubs and bars, which they were also allowed to pivot to F&B outlets. So if you look at, as of March of this year, after several months of operations of these massage establishments, former pubs, bars, KTV businesses pivoting to being F&B outlets and so on, situation was stable, numbers of cases, infections was generally low. So that's the context and the background to why pubs, bars, KTV outlets were allowed to pivot and provide F&B. 2, it has been suggested that we should have assumed or known that KTV operators will cheat, allow themselves to become semi-brothels, even though they were only allowed to provide F&B. And there have been suggestions ranging from we were in effect in cahoots with KTVs, which is a suggestion in a recent, quite unbalanced Nikkei article. Or alternatively, we were very naive not to realize what happens in KTVs. The truth is we were neither in cahoots with the KTV operators, nor are we as naive as some suggest. Let me explain. I think most people will accept it'll be wrong to treat all the 430-odd businesses, KTV operators, pubs, bars, who want to change to provide F&B automatically as crooks. Right? Several are genuine operators. They want to pivot over to provide F&B. That is the only way they can survive. If you ask SNBA, SEA, there are KTVs which cater to families. There are many which do legitimate business, and they were crying out for help. So more than 400 such businesses converted, and about 100 exited the nightlife industry. At the same time, as we were considering this, yes, MTF, government, does know that there are some KTV operations, pubs, bars with dodgy reputations. Should we have said to them, no, you cannot convert to F&B? And for some, if you look at their premises, darkened rooms, not the most optimal for dining, and people might well say, why would I want to go here for dining? It appears commonsensical to say this is dodgy and doubtful, but in law it's not so straightforward. If the person comes to you and says, yes, I want to convert and I will keep to the rules, this is how my business was perfectly legal in the past, and now I will continue to be legal, then the agencies will have to look him in the eye and say, you can't get a license to become a food place because we don't think you are going to keep to the law in future. We think you're going to break the law, even though you have committed no offense, and even though you confirm that you will follow the rules. So I'll come back to this later. So in addition to seeing if we can say no to those with dodgy reputations, part of the answer has got to be enforcement. And I will also say realistically, the people who are going to cheat, going to do illegal things, will do them anyway. They will use lounges, flats, warehouses, various places. It has gone on, and I'm sure it goes on, regardless of whether we allow the change to F&B. And there have been several illegal operations in different places outside of KTV outlets or ex-KTV outlets, which have been busted. So as of November 2020, it was a risk-assessed approach, and in general, it was working if you look at it as of March this year, with a relatively low number of cases. We then had the Delta variant, completely different transmissibility. That variant came into the KTVs, created a cluster. There is some public confusion. Minister for Health, my colleague, has spoken about it a number of times to clarify it. The confusion that the KTV cluster was somehow the reason for the recent phase 2 heightened alert, tightened restrictions imposed on 22nd of July. That is not so. He has clarified it. That's not so. If we had only the KTV cluster, then we would not have had to move to phase 2 HA or the tightened restrictions. In fact, the MTF, as he pointed out, considered the KTV cluster and decided we can manage it without having to impose any additional restrictions. And as he said in his speech, the KTV cluster has been brought under control fairly quickly, tracing, testing, ring fencing the cases. So we have about 5 new cases linked to the KTV cluster each day for the past few days. He gave you the figures. I have the figures as of 24th of July, 232 cases, 49 in hospital, none have been or are in ICU. So let me summarize by making 3 points. About 430 businesses pivoted to F&B for several months. Cases, infections overall in Singapore were low. The new Delta variant caused a KTV cluster that has been brought under control. And 3, if we were facing only the KTV cluster, there would have been no need for any tightened measures. Tightening of the measures is due to the cluster at the Jurong fishery port. It has spread from the ports to the markets and the hawkers and into the wider community. My colleagues have explained how this happened. Some are under the misimpression that the virus went from the KTVs to the fisheries port. The evidence we have doesn't suggest that. The virus seems to have come from the region to our port, JFP. Now, with this background, there is a live issue which I will share with members. The SNBA has sent an open letter, appealed for the industry to work more closely with the government to report illegal activities, among other things. And they have also pointed out pivoting has helped many legitimate businesses to survive. So should we allow them to reopen and continue as F&B operations? This brings me to the earlier question I posed. Some of them, when you look at the premises, you do question if they can really be F&B, but it requires us to say flat out to the operators, regardless of what you say, I'm not going to believe you, and I'm not going to allow you to operate an F&B. Agencies are working on the conditions that can be imposed, like CCTVs, various other conditions, over and above what's applied to F&B outlets. They will also have to consult with the AGC. Can we say no to an operator if we think it might be dodgy, even if the operators undertake to comply with the conditions? It's not so straightforward. Once these issues are assessed, MTF has to decide on whether the opening or reopening can be allowed. I will now deal with the questions which have been raised on enforcement. The period October 2020 to 10th of July 2021, the police conducted 202 operations against pivoted outlets, as well as other outlets which were operating illegally. So this is what I said earlier. Assume we had said no to all pivoting of F&B operations, there would still be places which offer sex and meetup opportunities. That was always going to happen. So we had one police operation every single day on average since October 2020. So this, I think, should put to rest any questions about enforcement actions by the police. One operation every day. And that has resulted in the detection of 58 Public Entertainment Act, Liquor Control Act infringements, 595 SMM breaches, 142 arrests for offenses under various laws, including the Public Entertainment Act, Liquor Control Act, Employment of Foreign Manpower Act, Immigration Act, not all in pivoted places, but also in completely illegal operations. To share a few examples, in October of 2020, police raided units along Ubi Road and Kalang Pudding Road. 57 persons were investigated for breach of SMMs. In November at Genting Lane, 24 persons were investigated for breach of SMMs. 10 women were arrested for work pass-related offenses. In February 2021, at Emerald Hill Road and again at Genting Lane, 88 persons investigated for breach of SMMs, one man arrested for working without a valid work permit. In April at Kitchener Road and Verdun Road, 45 persons investigated for breach of SMMs, 7 men and 1 woman arrested. In all the cases, items such as karaoke equipment, liquor were seized. Operators are being investigated. Enforcement operations were also conducted over 20 weekends at every single festive occasion since October of 2020. About 400 F&B outlets, including pivoted outlets, were inspected in each operation. To date, agencies have imposed around 100 closure orders on F&B outlets, including on about 40 pivoted outlets. As I said to the House just now, there were about 437 pivoted outlets, so roughly 10% have been acting illegally, and about 60 other F&B outlets also were in breach. So SFA has permanently revoked the food license of 7 pivoted outlets as of 23rd of July. So let me now move to this business of hostesses. Since the onset of COVID-19, the rules are that hostessing is not allowed in any setting. The women who were caught were likely in breach of their visit or work pass conditions, and they were operating illegally. And the first woman, much attention has centered on her, linked to the KTV cluster, had come into Singapore in February of 2021 through the boyfriend-girlfriend category under the what we call a familial ties lane. I'll refer to it as FTL, sponsored by a Singapore citizen who applied for her on the basis that he was her boyfriend. Now, let me explain this boyfriend-girlfriend category. At the start of COVID-19 last year, we banned short-term visitors from coming into Singapore. So as of September last year, the ban on short-term visitors continued. Basically, only Singapore residents can come back, some of their relatives, and some business travelers. In October last year, we introduced flexibility to allow boyfriends and girlfriends to come into Singapore. And why? We had almost a complete ban on short-term visitors, so boyfriends, girlfriends could not come in. There were many appeals. And for background reference, in the 10 years between 2000 to 2019, there were about 120,000 Singapore citizens who married who were in non-resident marriages. About 1 in 4 marriages were between Singaporeans and non-Singaporean partners. So it's quite common for Singaporeans to have relationships with non-Singaporeans. This boyfriend-girlfriend category was specifically introduced in the context of the ban on short-term visitors to allow Singaporeans who were in relationships with foreign partners to be reunited because they had been separated for a long time due to border restrictions. And this was after numerous appeals on this were received. Meanwhile, there was a parallel development around September, October 2020. We announced the unilateral opening to specific countries and regions which were of lower COVID risk, including Vietnam, Brunei, New Zealand, Australia, except Victoria State. Our assessment was the risk of importation of the virus was assessed to be low. Vietnam specifically had a comprehensive public health surveillance system, had displayed successful control over COVID at that time, and the last 4 weeks of September 2020, it had 0 local COVID cases. So under the unilateral opening, travelers could seek entry into Singapore by applying for an air travel pass, and this means short-term travelers from these countries were allowed to come in. In February 2021, due to the worsening COVID situation in Vietnam, we suspended the unilateral opening between Singapore and Vietnam, which meant that short-term travelers from Vietnam could not come in from February 2021 under the unilateral opening. ICA then began to receive many applications for Vietnamese to come into Singapore under the boyfriend-girlfriend category. And people are quite No, I wasn't going to say skeptical. I was going to say inventive. So to emphasize, once we suspended the unilateral opening with Vietnam in February of 2021, there were many applications under the boyfriend-girlfriend category. We looked at it, scratched our heads. The applications raised concerns because, I just give examples, several examples. There will be one Vietnamese applicant and multiple sponsors claiming to be the lady's boyfriend. There will be Singaporean sponsors, many who applied for multiple girlfriends. It's possible, but, sponsors who are already married to someone else applying, many men claiming to be a single lady's boyfriend, I mentioned it earlier, and sponsors who are unable to substantiate when we ask questions. What relationship do you really have with this person who is proposed to become sponsored? But as members of parliament will know, the residents will come to the MPs and say, I'm a Singapore citizen, I've done national service, why are you not allowing my girlfriend to come in? We all have received such appeals. ICA received. But when we looked at these applications for girlfriends, and they were all primarily girlfriends to come in, we decided this won't do. We have to stop this. So in March of 2021, this girlfriend-boyfriend category was removed. So you can no longer appeal for a boyfriend or girlfriend to come in. So ICA moved quite fast, right? February, the unilateral opening with Vietnam was suspended. The next month, in March, the boyfriend-girlfriend category was scrapped because we took the view that this was being abused. So we created this category, boyfriend-girlfriend, during a pandemic last year, October, because we wanted to be compassionate. Now, if you wanted to rank the organizations in terms of compassion, I don't think most people will put ICA at number 1 on the list. But, and MHA will not usually be accused of being the most compassionate either. But we did want to try and be compassionate and helpful because of the number of appeals. And people want their loved ones to come in, and we want to try and help. But if the system is abused, then we have to stop it. If it's mutated, we have to stop it. But unfortunately, what that has meant is that many legitimate applications are now being refused. ICA has also taken action against, in respect of dodgy applications by rescinding the approvals, barring the travelers from entry into Singapore, and suspending the sponsors and travelers from future applications. Apart from the FTL category, we have other avenues for foreigners to enter into Singapore during this pandemic, but very limited. They include MOM's work pass holder lane and MOE's student pass holder lane, where applicants are required to submit their application to MOM and MOE respectively for entry approval and are subject to screening, obviously. There are also short-term visitors who are already in Singapore before the border controls were imposed in March of 2020. And for these persons, ICA assesses their application for extensions of their short-term visit pass on a case-by-case basis. It takes into consideration factors including restrictions on international travel, flight availability, and whether the applicants have family ties in Singapore. So, tying that back to the police operations against nightlife outlets, recent operations. 29 women aged between 20 and 47 of various nationalities have been arrested for offenses under the Employment of Foreign Manpower Act and other laws. The 29 include permanent residents, work pass holders, S-pass holders, short-term pass holders, 1 who came in under the unilateral opening, 5 who had come in under the girlfriend category, long-term visit pass holders, other passes, student pass, dependents pass. Permanent residents unlikely to have committed any offense except for maybe safe distancing measures. Others on work pass would be in breach of their work pass conditions if they were performing services as hostess, but those on visit passes would be in breach as well by working without a work permit. But if they say they weren't working, then we have to show that they were in breach. And it's often cat and mouse. And as members will know, we can't use the trace together data for this. So far, 16 women have had their passes cancelled, and they have been or will be deported. Investigations are ongoing in respect of the other women. And of course, the operations, some of them are pivoted outlets, several of them are not, in other places, in warehouses, and so on. And we continuously have to look for them, rely on tip-offs as well as our own intelligence, and keep trying to keep it under control. So I think I've dealt with many of the questions that have been raised. Thank you.